Good evening, everyone. Welcome back. Tonight we'll be talking about the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism, which to a great extent is the style of Judaism that we're still living today. We still use their calendar. We still use the Bible that they assembled. We still use their structure of time and of the life cycle. We're still responding to them even if we don't necessarily accept their authority as previous generations did. But the rabbis really, in some ways, mark the beginning of the medieval period in Jewish life. If you have antiquity, which would be ancient times, the beginnings of history through a certain point, and then you have the modern period, which begins with the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, we're in what's called the Middle Ages. And it's really too bad that the Middle Ages often get short shrift because people are really fascinated by antiquity with the Bible and Egyptian civilization and Mesopotamian, Babylonian culture and the Greeks and the Romans. And then they get really interested in the Renaissance and Enlightenment and modernity, which leads to today. And the Middle Ages are sort of stuck in the middle. They don't get as much attention, even though they're 1,000 years of, or even 1,500 years of really important events, they don't get as much attention. And just to demonstrate that, in our own class, it's the shortest section. So we have maybe 8 lessons on antiquity, and we've got 8 lessons on modernity, and we got 4 on the Middle Ages. So that's the way it goes. The Middle Ages will just have to survive. And the time period we're talking about for the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism is sort of the end of antiquity, or what's called late antiquity in Jewish culture. We're talking from about the last century BCE to the first few centuries of the Common Era. You'll recall from our previous class on the Roman period, this sect of Judaism in the Second Temple period called the Pharisees, in Hebrew, the Prushim, which literally means the separatists. But these were people who followed the traditional practice in the temple, but also believed that they had what they called the teachings of the fathers, other traditions that had been handed down in a line of transmission that enabled them to make some modifications to the traditional practice. So if the Sadducees, the temple establishment, would do Shabbat in the dark with no fires lit, because the Torah says literally, you shall not kindle a fire on Shabbat, the Pharisees, on the other hand, could say, well, if we light a fire before Shabbat starts, then we can allow it to continue to burn even after Shabbat has begun. And so this teaching of the fathers, this tradition that's been handed down of how to interpret that text, enabled them to be a little bit more flexible in their ritual practice. This proved to be a great advantage after the year 70 of the Common Era, because 2 of the 3 major sects in Judaism were destroyed in that period. The Hellenistic Jews survived because they weren't based in one particular place and certainly not focused on Jerusalem. But the Sadducees, who are basically the Zadokites, the priests in Jerusalem and their followers, were out of a job after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. And the Essenes, this ascetic sect, whose major center was in Qumran near the Dead Sea, they were also destroyed by the Roman army on their way to wipe out the Zealots sometime between 70 CE and 73 CE. We're very fortunate that this community, in realizing the destruction was near, hid their books in jars and caves near the community. And that's where we ultimately would find the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because it was very dry and because they were kept in jars and because the community tried to hide them, they managed to survive. And we have those documents. But we don't have the Essenes anymore. They're gone as well. The Pharisees managed to survive because they see the writing on the wall and decide to flee. There's a famous story of sort of the last Pharisee, the first rabbi. His name is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who escapes from the siege of Jerusalem. The story is that his followers put him in a coffin and pretend that he's dead to take him out of the city, and then he makes his escape that way. He ultimately asks the Roman general the permission to create an academy far away from Jerusalem in a place, in English it's also often written as Jamnia, it's Yavne in Hebrew, all the way on the Mediterranean Sea, far away from Jerusalem, to be able to preserve these ancestral traditions. So ultimately, the rabbinic style of Judaism evolves out of the Pharisees because they are not caught up in the destructions of Jerusalem during the Great Revolt against the Romans. Now, over time, there emerges 2 separate Jewish experiences, one in the East and one in the West. In the East, the Jews are not under the Roman Empire at all. They're under an empire first called the Parthian Empire, and later the Sasanian Empire. These are polytheistic empires that are more or less tolerant of Jews living there. And that leads to the large center of Jewish life based in what is today Baghdad, back then was still called Babylon. And remember, those Jews descended back from the Jews who had fled, had been exiled, in fact, during the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. They stayed in Babylon and maintained a Jewish connection, even though they were in diaspora. So you have the Jews in the east, based more or less in Mesopotamia around Babylon. The Jews in the west initially have some official government recognition. There's something called the Patriarchate, where you have a descendant of King David who becomes the head of a rabbinic court, the Sanhedrin, who has some sort of political authority of the people in that territory. But what changes Jewish fortunes in the West is in the 330s, the Roman Empire converts to become the Christian Byzantium Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, now seeing itself as a supersessor, as a replacement for Judaism, begins to persecute the Jews in the West. Ultimately, the Patriarchate is abolished around 425 of the Common Era, which leads to a compilation of the rabbinic teachings from that territory in a much earlier stage, where the Babylonian teachings are allowed to develop further. Ultimately, this will result in two Talmuds. We'll talk about the Talmud in a little bit. The shorter, less authoritative one is called the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. Used to be called the Palestinian Talmud until politics took over. And then the more authoritative Talmud is called the Babylonian Talmud, in Hebrew, the Bavli. That's longer, covers more of the material of rabbinic teaching. So that's sort of a quick historical overview of the major events that impact Jewish life in this time period. But this is really a period of the history of ideas, much more than the history of events and wars and battles and so on. Jews are living in this other kind of history for this part of the Jewish saga. So Rabbinic Judaism ideologically represents a paradox. It's the paradox of a major transition claiming to be the ancient tradition. Okay? Now, often when you make changes, you claim you're going back to the vision of the founders or the original concept. I mean, you hear about this even now in American politics with Christian nationalism and originalism in the Constitution and all kinds of other claims that we're not changing anything, we're just going back to the tradition. Ironically, even the Reform movement in Judaism in the 19th century claimed they were going back to the Judaism of the prophets to replace the Judaism of the rabbis, but they're restoring an old version. No one wants to claim to be new. So it's somewhat radical to say, no, this is not old and I'm new and I'm proud. That's unusual. In this case as well, the rabbis are trying to claim an ancient tradition, even though they're making many changes. So some of the transitions that take place in this period ideologically, first of all, you've swapped from the Jerusalem temple to having multiple centers. You now have an institution that started before the temple was destroyed because people lived far away. It was a house of meeting. And the Hebrew for house of meeting is Beit Knesset, or in English, a synagogue. The synagogue now becomes the center of Jewish life. It still faces Jerusalem, but now what you put where Jerusalem would be is something new. It's an ark with a Torah, or a niche in the wall that could hold a Torah scroll. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Torah in Rabbinic Judaism in a minute. But you have major geographic centers. There's a large Jewish population living in the Galilee, for example, and you can see beautiful examples of preserved synagogues and floor mosaics in what now is southern Syria. Unfortunately, you can't get to see them, but also in northern Israel and the Galilee, you can see wonderful examples of these synagogues with beautiful mosaics, and sometimes even mosaics of things we wouldn't expect to find in a Jewish synagogue, like a picture of the zodiac on the floor. And you think that's polytheistic, and the sun god with his chariot and what? Well, evidently the lines between Jewish and pagan were more flexible, even than the rabbis claimed it to be in their literature. So this is why, again, you have to dig and find the reality, not just read the official story and assume that that's true. So you have Jews in Babylonia, you've got Jews in the Roman diaspora, Jews still in Alexandria, in Egypt, in North Africa, in the Galilee, in Jerusalem ultimately after a couple centuries. So now you have multiple centers instead of one center. That's a major change. A second major transition is gradually you have the emergence of one dominant style of Judaism, which will become Rabbinic Judaism. It doesn't really assert full dominance until the Arab empires, which we'll talk about in our next session. But it begins to become the dominant style even by the 300s, 400s of the Common Era, where before, during the Second Temple, you had Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Hellenistic Jews and the political zealots who led the revolt, and you had all of these varieties out there. After the temple's destroyed, you've lost a couple of those, and the Hellenistic Jews have their own revolt a couple decades after the Great Revolt that also really undermines their position. Christianity is very attractive to Hellenistic Jews, and many of them are pulled off in that direction. So ultimately, Rabbinic Judaism is what survives, and the idea of having one dominant style of Judaism is something new. But again, they're going to claim that's what it's always been. Moses is a rabbi. That's why you have this phrase, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi. It's projecting back the title, the authority, the lineage of a rabbi all the way back to Moses, because that's the claim of not changing. Now, another major change that happens in this time period, as best we know, is the closing of the biblical canon. So you had, in the ancient period, I'm going to share a chart that talks a little bit about this. In the ancient period, you had a collection of books. The Bible was the books, it was scrolls. It's only when you begin to write books in what's called a codex, which means individual sheets of paper where you can write on both sides, that you can manage to fit it all into one book. Because if you're on scrolls, you might have had a Torah scroll before or felt one, it's heavy, and that's only 5 books, not 22 books. It would be unmanageable in a scroll form. But once you can do a codex, you can create one book out of it, and then you have to decide what books are in and what books are out. And there's a very interesting discussion recorded in the early collections of rabbinic sayings and laws that were originally passed down by word of mouth and ultimately written down, that discussing which books are the holy books. You may recall from our discussion of the priestly sense of purity that if you touch a book that's divine, it actually makes your hands unclean because you've crossed the boundary between this world and the next world, the supernatural realm. So they debate which of these books makes the hands unclean. And it turns out a book that does not make your hands unclean is of this world and therefore not holy enough to save in the canon. And so some books they knew of that existed at that time were not included in there. They wind up in a section called the Apocrypha in a Protestant Bible, or they're still kept in the Catholic Bible based on the Greek Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew Bible. And you'll see here on this chart, the Hebrew Bible is often referred to as the Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, the first 5 books, Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim. But when you put a K at the end of a word, it becomes a Ch. It's the grammatical structure of that letter. So it becomes Tanakh with a Ch at the end. And that acronym means the Hebrew Bible. You'll note the note on the side. It's not exactly the same as the Old Testament because they're in different orders. And again, the Catholic Old Testament will have books in it that the Protestant Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible do not have in them. Now, we know that even as early as around 200 BCE, there was a 3-part division to this canon. The author Ben Sira writes about the Torah, the prophets, and the other writings. The problem is we don't know what the other writings included back then because the other writings is just miscellaneous, right? Could be anything. So when the rabbis decided what was in and what was out, they didn't write these books. These books were written before the rabbis, but they decided what books would be in and in what order. So as one example of seeing the rabbinic structure here, you'll notice there's these 5 scrolls in the Ketuvim, the writings. You have Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Now, in the book of Ruth, it begins, in the days when the judges judged. And in the Septuagint, in the Greek Bible, that's the basis for the Old Testament, the book of Ruth actually appears right after the book of Judges, because in the days when the judges judged. But the rabbis had decided to assign these books to be read at specific holidays, and they put them in the order they appear, starting in the spring. So Song of Songs is read during Passover. Ruth is read during Sukkot. Lamentations is read during the 9th of Av, morning of the destruction of the temple. Ecclesiastes is read during Sukkot in the fall. Shavuot is Ruth in the spring. and so early summer, and then Esther is read at the end of winter at Purim time. So they're in the order of the rabbinic holiday cycle and assignment. So that's, again, a clue that the rabbis are the ones who put them in and decided where would they go. Now, some books didn't make it into the canon because of a claim that prophecy ended with Malachi. He was supposedly the last prophet. The book of Daniel actually is written much later, but they had to ascribe it to Daniel, who lived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, because it had to be post-dated, back into the early period for it to be accepted. This is sometimes what's called pseudepigrapha, where you're ascribing the authorship to somebody else. But closing the canon raises a different question. Once you've decided this is all that God said, that's the end. Now someone has to answer, what does it mean? You can't assume the text is self-evident and everybody knows exactly what it means. For example, think of one of the 10 commandments, often translated as thou shalt not kill. Actually, in Hebrew, it's lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. But it still begs the question, what counts as murder? Is it murder if someone's sneaking into your house and you kill them? Is it murder, and this is actually an example that's given, if you're chopping with an axe and you swing back and the head of the axe flies off and hits someone in the head and kills them? Does that count as murder? Well, from the clan vengeance world, sure. You killed mine, I'm going to kill one of yours. In the legal jurisprudence world, maybe you require motive, or you require premeditation, or you have other categories, or manslaughter. You have some other categories here, and you have to decide what goes where. What if there's a conflict of duties? What if it says, do not steal and honor your mother and father, and your parents are thieves? Do you turn them in? Do you join the family business? What do you do? Well, so someone has to tell you what it means and how it works. So that is perpetual employment for the rabbis as the dayanim, as the judges who will help tell you what it means. And finally, the last radical transformation of Rabbinic Judaism is the change from sacrifice to something else. What does it mean to do Jewish? How do you practice Judaism? Well, practicing Judaism in the temple time meant going to the temple and offering an animal sacrifice. That's how you practice Judaism. But now there's no temple, and the priests are a ceremonial role. What does it mean to do Jewish? How do you earn cosmic points for the rabbis? Basically, three things. Instead of offering the sacrifice, we will offer words instead. So you recite certain prayers at the same times as the daily sacrifices. That's when you'll offer your prayers, and you'll offer them in a certain order. And on Shabbat, when you had a musaf, an additional sacrifice, you now have a musaf recitation of the core prayers, an additional recitation of those core texts. If it's a holiday with sacrifices, you read the Torah part that describes the sacrifices. It's almost as if you're saying to God, I want you to know that I know what I'm supposed to do. I can't do it, there's no temple, but I'm going to read the passage that told me what to sacrifice so you know that I know what I would have done if I could. So you have the words as replacing the animal sacrifices. A second thing that you can do to earn positive points is to study the source. You shift from a sacrifice to a study culture. And so studying the text, studying the manual for life, so to speak, is a worthy pursuit in and of its own sake, even if sometimes you come out with ridiculous results. There's one example of a student who was praised who could come up with 45 different ways that a creepy crawly, centipede kind of insect was actually kosher. And everybody knows that it's not kosher. But if you can come up with reasons to try to make it kosher, that's in the school of Talmudic Torah reasoning, that's seen as praiseworthy. So studying the Torah, studying the revelation itself is important. And finally, the number one way you earn points is doing mitzvot, doing commandments. Of course, that begs the question, what are the commandments? And how many are there? And what do I have to do? There's more than 10 for sure, because the 10 commandments, there's plenty of other passages around there that talk about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, and how to plow your fields, and what kind of clothes you can wear, and what kind of sexual practices you can do. There's all kinds of commandments out there. So what are the commandments and how do I do them? And here's where the rabbis come in with an innovation that claims to be ancient and explains everything. There wasn't just one Torah given on Mount Sinai. There were two Torahs given on Mount Sinai, a written Torah and an oral Torah. And the oral Torah was passed down word of mouth in a parallel track to the written Torah. They were both given to Moses on Sinai. But the written Torah is the parallel, the supplement to the written Torah. In some ways, it's the manual of how do you read this? How should you interpret this? The oral Torah answers the questions that you might find in the written Torah, or ambiguities, or contradictions, or conflicts. The oral Torah teaches you how to read the written Torah. So you actually can't read the written Torah without knowing the oral Torah. Think of the oral Torah like Supreme Court decisions, which tell you what a well-regulated militia actually means, or at least what the judges have decided a well-regulated militia actually means. If you just read the original source book, you're not going to get it right. First of all, if you just read the Constitution, you're not going to know what the speed limit is, or what counts as embezzlement, right? You have to go to some other source to get those details. And so the oral Torah is going to include all the details of the laws and how to enforce it. And it says if you damage someone, you have to pay restitution. What does that mean? Well, the rabbis are the ones that are going to define it based on the oral Torah. But you see, they're claiming that even their new rulings are part of this ancient oral Torah. There's a famous saying that whatever a student innovates before his teacher was already said to Moses on Sinai. So even if it's new, it's actually part of this old tradition. Now, how is that possible? Well, there's a couple of ways to think about it. Maybe it was told to Moses and he forgot it, or it didn't get passed down and then it was sort of recovered by the student poring over the text. Or maybe it's a kind of ongoing revelation that God doesn't speak directly through visions and prophets now, but he speaks through the words of the text, and you divine the divine will, so to speak, out of your interpretation. Or third, maybe it was implicit in the text all along. There's a rabbinic saying that there are 70 faces to the Torah, Shivim Panim LaTorah. And the idea is that it was all already there. It was all intended to be there from the very beginning. It's like when you buy a piece of property and you own all the mineral rights underneath it. You don't know that there's oil there, and then one day you're shooting for some food and up from the ground comes a bubbling crude, right? That's the Beverly Hillbillies opening theme song. They had the mineral rights to that property, and there you go. So now it's theirs. They never knew it was there. They were millionaires the whole time. They didn't know it. So the interpretation of the Torah is sometimes that uncovering of what was always intended to be there. And so it is old, but it's also new. And there are many stories that try to dramatize this dynamic of the old-new religion. One example is a story where Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and he sees God putting little crowns on top of the letters. If you know a Torah scroll, the Hebrew font in Torah, there are occasionally these little 3 lines on top of certain letters like crowns. And Moses says, "Why are you putting these crowns on the letters?" And God says to him, "Well, someday in the future, there'll be a wonderful teacher named Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, who will make laws and laws and laws out of these crowns on the letters." And Moses says, "Show me, I'm curious." And so they magically transport forward in time about 1,500 years, and Moses arrives in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, and he takes a seat in the back row. And he doesn't understand anything that Akiva is talking about until Akiva says, in answer to a question, "Where do we know this law?" He says, "It is a law from Moses on Sinai." And then Moses feels better. Now, the irony of this story is that Moses doesn't understand the implications of his own teaching that he's getting, and he's sort of taken dictation for. And the law that's ascribed back to Moses on Sinai hadn't heard. Moses is on Sinai and he hasn't heard it yet. So there's this, again, this sort of paradox of ancient and implicit and divinity and revelation and interpretation all sort of coexisting in one reality. And occasionally, just occasionally, the rabbis take on the mantle of being able to command you to. As one example, some of you may know the traditional blessing for lighting Hanukkah candles, which is, "Blessed are you, God, who has commanded us to light the candles of Hanukkah." Where in the Torah does he command you to light Hanukkah candles? Remember, the Maccabees are way, way after the Torah narrative is over. The Torah is done with Moses not even entering the promised land. The Maccabees are 1,000 years later. And so the proof text the rabbis give when they're asked, they're challenged by themselves. Another rabbi says, "Where do we get the right to say this?" And the rabbis respond from this verse where it says, "You will appoint judges and they will tell you what to do." In other words, we're the judges. And we occasionally can tell you that God commanded you, even if it doesn't say explicitly in the text that God commanded. Again, who gets to tell you what it means? That's the real power. Now, just to clarify, when we refer to studying Torah in an Orthodox or traditional Jewish setting, it doesn't just mean the first 5 books. That's the most authoritative. But it could also mean the whole Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. It could mean this oral Torah of the Talmud and rabbinic law. All of that counts as studying Torah, of following Torah. So when an Orthodox Jew says, "Are you a Torah true Jew?" they don't mean the 5 books. They mean the canon of oral and written Torah all together. Now, the first generation of rabbis who began this process of creating an oral Torah were referred to as the Tanaim, or the repeaters. They would actually memorize the law as it had been recited down to them, and then add their own teachings a little bit at a time. And you would rely on this reciter to remember a whole body of rabbinic law. Ultimately, around the year 200 to 225 of the Common Era, the patriarch at the time, the head of the Western diaspora, remember, is a man named Judah Hanasi, Judah the Prince, who decides to compile all of this oral Torah tradition into a written form. And there's actually a debate over, are you allowed to write down the oral Torah? But he decides that we're getting so dispersed, we need some kind of centralized authority. So they create what's called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is this first collection of rabbinic law that's divided into 6 what are called orders, or 6 categories of law. There are seasons, that's like holidays. There's seeds, that's all the laws of agriculture. There's vows, that's the making promises and oaths, and then how do you get out of it if you need to, and so on. There's a whole section called women. There isn't one called men, because that's the assumed case. This is the special case of women issues like family purity laws and divorce and marriage and all that kind of stuff. There's a section called purities that has to do with ritual purity and impurity. And finally, there's a section called Kudashim, holy things, which is both the theological section, but also how things were run in the temple and ritual practice, because they want to keep studying the laws of the temple in case the Messiah does come and rebuild it, and then they'll be ready to go. So, and then there are subsections in those. So in the section on in the volume on seasons, you have one for Rosh Hashanah, and one for Yom Kippur, and one for Sukkot, and one for Passover, and one for, and so on. So you've got all these different categories for the different holidays and so on in other sections. Originally, this oral Torah of the Mishnah had very little connection with the written Torah. It was seen as a parallel source of law, and it didn't necessarily need a direct tie to the written Torah. But after the Mishnah was written down, of course, the debates continued. The conversations kept going. The arguments were never ending. And ultimately, those arguments were also recorded, and those clarifications and those debates were written down, including sometimes a desire to connect the written Torah with the oral Torah. So often you'll find in this later part a question: from where do we know X? From where do we know that you can break the Sabbath to save a life? They're not asking, can you break the Sabbath to save a life? They know the answer. But they're saying, from where in the written text can we prove that we can save a life? And so that proof text game is part of this next stage of rabbinic literature, which is called the Gemara. The Gemara means completion. Gemar is finish or complete. So you have the Mishnah and the Gemara which is like the commentary explanation of the Mishnah, together that would make a Talmud. So I'll show you an example of a Talmud page so you can see what it looks like. This is based on the Vilna edition, and it's actually divided into pages that are labeled by the sheet and the side of the sheet. So you'd have page 2a, and you notice in the upper left corner there's a bet, it's the second Hebrew letter. So this is page 2a, and then you'll have 2b, which is the back side. So they're actually counting the sheet of paper. So Talmudic references are often like 56a or 56b, which means the sheet of paper, and then to the front or the back of that. But you'll notice that you've actually got multiple texts included here in one place, and this handy dandy color code gives you a breakdown. So first you have the Mishnah text here. That's the original rabbinic oral Torah or commentary or discussion, compiled around 220 of the Common Era. Then you have the Gemara, which is like the footnotes, the commentary, the explanation, the discussion, the citations. That's also presented here in the standard Aramaic text. And then you have a whole series of commentaries to it. On the right side, for example, you have the commentary that is written by Rashi, who lives in northern France in the 1000s of the Common Era. And it's written in a different kind of font. It's called Rashi's script, which people think it was based on Rashi's handwriting. It actually is not. It was just done as a different script, so you could tell the difference between the Mishnah text and the commentary. And since Rashi was the first major commentator, that's why it was called Rashi's script. But they didn't stop with Rashi. They added the Tosafists, who are descendants of Rashi a century or two later. You have other comments by other major thinkers. You have these little sort of pink boxes here where they're actually putting in a citation because the Mishnah and the Gemara didn't bother quoting what book they're quoting from. Now, keep in mind, if I were to quote to you, Romeo, oh Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Would I need to cite the play Romeo and Juliet? Probably not. You'd know what it's from. So that's their approach to biblical text. They'll often quote a passage in the Bible and they don't even bother giving the citation or the full verse even. They might just give part of the verse to make their point. So this is the idea of the Talmud. It's multiple generations arguing together on the same topic, sometimes going off in very strange tangents, more or less grouped around those statements of law collected in the early part of Rabbinic Judaism around 220 in the Mishnah. You've got the commentary in the Gemara, and then ongoing commentary and discussion even now. There's even a tradition that started in the 1920s of studying one page of Talmud a day, called the Daf Yomi, the daily page. We just started a new cycle in 2020. If you did one page a day based on this Vilna edition of the Babylonian Talmud, it would take you 7.5 years to get through the entire written Talmud. So it is definitely a large body of material. So what I wanted to do now is take you through a couple examples of texts so you can see what the Rabbinic Judaism approach is all about. And these are the texts that were in the documents in the shared folder that I sent. Here you go. This talks a little bit more about the oral Torah, the Mishnah and Talmud put together. Okay, so here's an example of a text from the Mishnah. This is in Sanhedrin in that holy things section that's a more theoretical one. All Israel has a portion of the world to come. As it says, all of them are righteous for eternity, shall they inherit the land, and so on. And these do not have a portion in the world to come. The one who says the resurrection of the dead is not from the Torah, and spoiler alert, you can read the whole Torah cover to cover. There is no resurrection of the dead there. But this is, again, asserting the authenticity of rabbinic interpretation. If you don't agree what we've interpreted out of the Torah, then you don't get a piece of that world to come. Or that the Torah is not from heaven, that it's not divinely revealed, or an apikoros, a heretic or a skeptic. And we saw the apikoros in the Roman Hellenistic period too. And Rabbi Akiva says, even the one who reads the heretical books, those outside books we told you not to read, if you read them, then you're going to be in trouble. Now here's an example of halakha, of Jewish law that's being described. The primary labors prohibited on Shabbat are 40 minus 1. Sowing, plowing, reaping. So they're giving you these general categories of work that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. And now the Gemara, the commentary on this comes in. You'll notice the pagination here is 73A to B, so it's the 73rd sheet, front and back. The Gemara says, why list the number? It says 40 minus 1. Why bother listing the number? Why not just list them? Rabbi Yochanan said, to teach that if one does them unaware of prohibitions, he's liable for each one. So if you had no idea about the rules at all, you'd still be liable for 39 offenses because they gave you the number. So now it starts with sowing and plowing. Let us examine closer. When farming is done, plowing is done first. So why have sowing before plowing? Normally you don't spread the seeds and then plow rows. You plow rows and then drop the seeds. They say, why this order? Well, this teaches about the land of Israel, where they sow seeds first and then plow. These are Babylonian Jews writing this about the wonderful, mythical, magical land of Israel where you can throw seeds on the ground and they still work. It is taught sowing, pruning trees, planting new plants, bending trees down to the ground to regrow roots, or grafting things together all count as one labor. They're all in one category. What does this teach? So this is a teaching that was passed down by word of mouth, that those are all one category. And why are they all put together? He who performs many tasks from one form of labor is only liable for one labor. They're all in the same category, so it's one violation, even if you've done different things. Rabbi Abba said that Rabbi Chia said that Chia Bar Ashi said that Rabbi Ami said. Now you get a flavor of the passing down the word of mouth, right? This, by the way, we'll see as well in Islamic tradition. They have something called the hadith, the traditions about Muhammad that are also word of mouth from this person to this person to this person. And we would say that's less reliable. We know the game of telephone, right? We would say the more chains and it's passed down, the less reliable it is. But in Rabbinic Judaism, the further back you go, the stronger the authority. So Rabbi Ami said, the one who prunes is liable because of planting, and the one who plants, bends, or grafts is liable because of sowing. So they're arguing which category do these actions fall into, and therefore are you liable once or twice because you've done two different major categories. Rabbi Kahana said if he prunes and kneads the wood, he's liable twice. Once for reaping, harvesting, and once for planting. So you can actually commit two violations in one action, depending on the intent. Rabbi Abba said, one who digs a hole on Shabbat, but only needs the dirt from it, is exempt from it. He didn't make a hole. Even though Rabbi Judah said, one is liable for a labor not performed for itself. So how do we harmonize these two? These seem to contradict. That is true for repairs, but here he's causing destruction. So you find a new circumstance that marks it as different. Another example of this kind of legalistic ritual practice debate is a debate over which shoe should you put on first, your right shoe or your left shoe. And the resolution ultimately is you slip on your left shoe, then your right shoe, but you tie your right shoe and then tie your left shoe. So that's where you sort of honor both traditions, but you have to do it, in a way that respects the tradition. And the tradition cares what shoe you put on first. Okay, it's that level of detail sometimes in halakha and Jewish law. Now, the other category of text you'll find in the Talmud, in rabbinic literature, is what's called agadah. And agadah sort of means, well, technically it's like everything that isn't halakha isn't law. It could be legends, it could be interpretation of rabbinic texts or of the Bible itself. So, for example, the binding of Isaac is reinterpreted as a dialogue between God and Abraham, trying to soften the blow, where they're talking back and forth, where in the original text, it doesn't have any dialogue, but the rabbis imagine a dialogue to fill in the hole. Or a discussion in a collection of midrash, of commentary on the biblical story that asks, why was the Torah begun with the letter Bet, the second letter in the alphabet? And there are 4 or 5 different reasons given based on even the shape of the letter Bet, not even the content of the words there. Even the shape of the letter can have a meaning. If God designed everything, he designed the letters, and he designed them with a purpose to teach you something if you interpret in the right way. But there are also the deeds of the sages, where their example becomes normative for later Jews. One example related to Shabbat, there's a discussion over whether you can leave a private space for a public space on Shabbat. And they tell the example of this famous rabbi who landed a ship on Shabbat and walked off the ship on a gangplank. And so he transferred domains. So his example tells you it's okay to do it. And then you get stories like this, which is in Bava Metzia, which is one of those more theoretical sections that describes an argument over the kosher status of an oven, which in the end is less important than what happens. On that day, Rabbi Eliezer responded saying that the oven was not kosher with all the answers in the world, but the other rabbis did not accept them. He said, if the halakha, if the law is as I say, the carob tree will prove it. And torn from its place was the carob tree 100 cubits. Others say 400. They can't even agree on how far the tree flew. There's different traditions. They said to him, one does not bring an argument from a tree. He responded and said, if the law is as I say, the stream of water will prove it. And the stream of water flowed backwards. And they said, again, you're not giving a reason, an argument. You're just doing miracles. He responded and said, if the law is as I say, the walls of the house of study should prove it. And they began to shake. And Rabbi Joshua rebukes the walls and says, butt out. When the students of the wise are disputing about the halakha, about the law, what is it your concern? So they did not fall in honor of one, and they did not say upright because of the other. They still are standing tilted in between, like the shoes, right? And so finally, he responded and said, if the halakha, if the law is as I say, it will be proved from heaven. And a heavenly voice came out and said, what do you have against Rabbi Eliezer? For the halakha, the law is as he says in all matters. Rabbi Joshua stands up again and rebukes the voice from heaven. He says, Lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven. Why it is not in heaven? Rabbi Jeremiah explained, already the Torah was given from Mount Sinai. We do not listen to the heavenly voice. We have already written at Mount Sinai in the Torah, Acharei Rabim talinu, after the many you will incline. Rabbi Nathan met Elijah later, the prophet, and said to him, what did God do in that hour? And he said, God smiled and said, my children defeated me. My children defeated me. Now, one of the ironies of this story is that the verse that's cited after the many you will incline actually has the opposite meaning if you read the whole verse. You look it up. Because it says, after the many you will incline not to do evil. But here the argument is being made. You can take part of the verse and make your point. After the many you should incline, even if they disagree with the heavenly voice. The Sanhedrin, the rabbinic court rules, and that defines the law even more than the original author. And just in case you were worried what the original author might think, there's this postscript here that says he laughed. It's like when your kids realize that if they combine rule number 7 and rule number 13, they can get what they want. And on one level, you're annoyed, but on another level, you say, how smart are you? And you're proud of them in some way. And so my children have defeated me is a proud parent, having handed off the job to the kids. Of course, it's not consistent everywhere. There are other times they do listen to a divine voice. But in this story, at least, the rabbis have the authority to make the interpretations, even above and beyond the voice coming from the heavens itself. So the result of this theology is this Rabbinic Judaism, where you sacrifice words through a prayer service instead of animals. You are doing mitzvot, commandments, and not sacrifices. And there are, according to the rabbis, 613 commandments. There are 248 positive commandments of thou shalt do, honor your mother and father, eat matzah on Passover. And there are 365 negative commandments, the thing you should not do. Do not murder, do not worship idols, do not steal, and so on. The Torah itself earns you points by studying the laws and by learning them. And the rabbis are not rabbis because of pedigree. This is a real change where the priestly pedigree was very important and the kingly pedigree was very important. Now anybody can be a rabbi based on what you know. It's in some ways a meritocracy. Obviously, it's a patriarchal meritocracy because women were not allowed to be rabbis until the 20th century. But it was on some level a meritocracy where it was your knowledge that made you a rabbi. And by the way, most rabbis were not professional rabbis. They had professions too. They were shoemakers and craftsmen and other kinds of real jobs. They didn't just make a living from being rabbis. And how do we atone for our sins? A famous story explains where Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, see the destruction of the temple. And Joshua cries, how shall we atone for our sins now? And Shimon ben Gamliel says we have other things we can do. We can study Torah, we can fulfill commandments, and gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Those can atone for us. And the power of the rabbis ultimately is that they get to tell you what the commandments are and how to do them, what the prayers are and how to say them and when, and what the Torah means. And as I've said before, those who can tell you what it means really have the power, even above and beyond the text as it was originally written.